No, just kind of watching. Appreciate you all. If I have any comments, maybe towards the end, but I appreciate you all being here, and kind of excited to see what you all come up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, there will be time for comments at the end for sure. We always allow those. Okay. I think at this point, Allison, I turn it back to you.
Great. I'm unmuted. Awesome. And hi, Jan. Notice that you just joined us. Hi, welcome. So we are continuing. This is our second meeting to discuss Q&A and to dive into that. So we have until 7, really until kind of 6:45, lots of time for public comment and for some next steps, because you are leaving tonight with a homework assignment. But we're going to continue with Q&A. We've got the expertise of the design team, and a lot of you have sent in questions. So again, last time we focused on a lot of the exterior, on the site considerations. Today we're getting into some of the interior layouts, and we're also saving some time to talk about cost, because that was a big theme that came up in our last meeting. Some of you have sent really detailed questions, and I think Jennifer will mention this in more depth. But there's a possibility that we might not get to the level of detail in your questions tonight. Kind of like we did last time, I want to make sure that we're hearing from as many people as possible. So I might be calling on folks who haven't had an opportunity to speak yet, or just making sure. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat, like we did last time, if you have additional questions or comments that you'd like to share, so we know kind of where folks are sitting, if they also have these questions, if they'd like to jump in with anything more. But the design team has worked to organize these questions in sort of buckets. So we'll work through those. And if you don't get your question answered, Catherine, Jennifer, and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, and I think Catherine is happy to follow up with folks one-on-one, and we can certainly share outcomes of those conversations with the rest of the task force. But if there are specifics that you'd like to get into that we might not have time for this evening, we'll be able to offer that for folks as well. So with that, Jennifer, I think you've got the master plan, and you're going to share some slides with us to kick us off, and then we'll dive on into those questions.
All right. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Move on here. So I just wanted to start here because last time we talked about this briefly, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this right now, but I did want to remind everybody of where we are in the process. We are currently at the master planning and feasibility stage right here. We're in the 3rd phase of this effort, and really in the meat of discovering what the possibilities are here on this site. As Allison noted, we have gotten a lot of questions. We had kind of a lull last week after our meeting, but then we got another rush of them right before the meeting. So thank you for sending those in. Some of your questions are very, very detailed, and as we talked about last time, some of those questions are really things that aren't addressed in later phases of the project. So we have schematic design, design development, construction documents, and into construction. So I appreciate everybody's comments, and we'll try to get to the bulk of them as we can. And we do have some time planned for that during our presentation. But I just did want to remind you that we still have a whole design phases coming up, and we're very early in the planning process right now. So last week we reviewed the big outside exterior issues with parking and building form, and touched on some of the historic questions. And tonight we really want to focus on more of the interior of the building. Obviously, there are a lot of schemes to look at, and I'm hoping that most of you have your packets with you so that we don't have to be looking at the screen, but we can be talking through the questions. And we just grouped these in ways that we saw the questions coming in, but also where we know that there's been some interest in some pieces. So tonight we want to talk through these subjects on the interior layouts, and then we'll give some time for I'll be able to review in more detail some of the cost information in Catherine and touch on Seismic. Well, there have been some questions on that. And then Catherine will be able to review the funding sources and that conversation at the end of our time tonight. So let's see, I think, whoops, that's for our cost. I don't even think that's just a little bit of a breakdown, but we'll get into that in just a second. I'm going to stop sharing, but I'm going to pick it back up here when we rejoin. So Jim, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and Ray and anybody else, everybody here.
Yeah, I think in terms of the agenda, one of the questions we want to address right up front that seems so poignant right now is the COVID-19 impact, potentially how we think about the design and construction. I might lead off with some thoughts on that. And then Ray, hopefully you can kind of supplement and help me out here. But it's certainly been at the forefront of our thinking, everyone's thinking, right? But for us, you know, we're a 60-person office and we're in an open office environment, and we're all last month been giving a lot of consideration to what it means to move back to office and how that might work incrementally. So issues just sanitation stations, the flow, the fact that when we think about an optimal layout of a library or a classroom or recreation space, that we need to take into account that 6-foot circle of separation, what that means in terms of less capacity, and how we think about furniture arrangements. Also barriers, hopefully people are wearing masks. That's certainly part of our protocol, but being able to create translucent visual barriers, how that actually impacts how we think about furniture systems that we might select that can be adaptable to that, because we hope there's you know, a solution to this and a remedy. And so when that happens, perhaps some of those barriers can go away. So flexibility is a really important issue. You know, mechanical systems, getting good airflow, having even HEPA filter type of considerations is really important. Our particular office is naturally ventilated, so that's actually a total plus from a mechanical perspective, and something that we might consider certainly for the Concord project, whether it's a gymnasium or a library space, is how can we bring fresh air and movement? That's a really key issue. We've also, we have a project under construction right now. It's the Beaverton Center for the Arts. They feel particularly challenged that the project's moving forward, and yet they're dependent on people feeling comfortable. I mean, large audience, up to 450 people coming to a performance. And so some of the things we're doing that we might think about here is automatic door openers. So the idea of hands-free, we're actually doing this on the Hillsborough Community Center that we're building right now, but more like a ball entry. So you don't have to touch the door. And that's also kind of works well in terms of universal access instead of having to touch a button. So that's a consideration. Obviously the placement of sanitation stations throughout. Actually at the Beaverton Center for the Arts, we're building them into the walls, so they're attached to the walls versus freestanding. Thinking about how you, versus cartridges, can we have refills that can be done in a operationally in a efficient way. Also restrooms, that's a big consideration, and one probably that we should all be the most concerned about. And so part of the idea is to have automatic door openers to the restrooms, basically have a hands-free environment. That means stalls for where the restrooms, the toilets are, that's all foot operated. You could hit a pedal and that door opens automatically. And so the idea is you aren't using your hands. Obviously, automatic sink, which is more conventional, or paper dispensers, but even urinals for men, the partitions are actually quite small. You can look across and see the person next to you. So are those partitions even higher? So yes, lots of considerations, making sure just from a planning standpoint that you have the capability to have wider, more generous corridors where possible to create two-way circulation, or have one-way circulation and premeditate routes so people aren't overlapping each other, going in opposite directions. Yeah, those are some of the considerations. What's great is we have a fair amount of time between now and when this project eventually goes out to bid. So we're going to learn a lot more than we know now. But a lot of these can actually just be good practices. And that's an important consideration too, that you build in more permanent considerations or strategies that don't date themselves. And so that's also, yes.
Jim, there's a question that came in from the chat, and this might actually be a Ray question from Gary on, in addition to some of these social distancing measures, are there considerations about handling the materials in a library? A library is a highly tactile environment. So are there additional things to think about in this pandemic world? It looks like we've got some other considerations from Mark in the chat, but I'll maybe over to you, Ray.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing this evolve in real time. Libraries responding to this condition right now. There are articles almost daily in one publication or another. There was one in the New York Times this morning. As far as materials go, the general thought that I've been reading about is that if you allow a material to sit for a day or two, it will lose any ability to transmit the virus. This particular library system with a link system has a point of where materials flow through, and I think it's likely that point will develop some techniques to further make sure that materials are sterilized. Mitzi, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, because we're actually facing this right now, since we're looking at beginning to offer services next week. Really, we're just going to need space for that. We're acquiring bins, and we plan on fairly large bins where the materials are returned. Staff do not have to touch them at that point. We can wheel them in the back, just place them in the workroom and date them, and then rotate them when they're ready to be checked in. So it's not necessarily an architectural feature, but we just need space in the workroom for these rolling bins.
Yeah, great. So that's an important part of it. Other parts, libraries are curiously evolving prior to this in a way that is useful for social distancing. The types of spaces that patrons like are becoming a little more personal and varied. So rather than the large room with everybody sitting right next to each other, there are alcoves and already social distanced lounge seating and table seating. That's not all the work that needs to be done. I think when you maybe a year ago had a set of desks that had 6 computers, I think moving forward there may be 4, and they may have plexiglass shields between them. We have been planning, in this case, for fairly low-rise main collection stacks that are on wheels, so those can be spaced differently. However, in the interest of density, if you really think about it, an aisle between 2 bookshelves, if you were to really conform, you need about 9 feet there, which would cut the capacity of the library in half or more. So the ideas that are developing are really more about circulation, so that there is a path through the stacks. You don't just enter at any gap between them, you enter at the ones that go the direction that you are going, and circulate following others rather than passing them as you go through an aisle. So I think curiously, you know, we're in pretty good shape with the way libraries are evolving, and then we have the tools to enhance that further and to really address this issue fairly well without major damage to the capacity and the programming of the library.
So while we're on that topic of library layout, I'm curious if task force members, you have kind of specific questions that Jim, Ray, and really Mitzi could help address in terms of the library layouts in those different design alternatives. And if you want to raise your hand if you have a question, now might be a great time just to spend some time talking through library layout. And if we don't have questions, I'm sure Jim and Jennifer can kick us off, but does anybody have any questions that they're sitting with on layout specifically, those library questions? I know you do. I mean,
there was a really interesting question that somebody, I forget who, brought up, which was about the concept, one that I really love, of the grand reading room that is occupied by rows of reading tables, frequently with little green glass lights. So you would go and get your material and then come in and sit at one of, you know, dozens of seats in the grand reading room. And, you know, this is still a model actually in some academic libraries, a fair number. And in some public libraries, because of the historic nature of those reading rooms, the New York Central is a good example of that. However, most libraries have drifted away from that because of the, you know, the way libraries have addressed our changing society and our changing culture and the changing demands on the library. So whereas in the past, one might go to the library to do some research and ask a librarian for a material that was retrieved from compact shelving or back storage, and then taken that material to a reading room and done their research. Today, they're more likely to plan ahead and have the material available, bring their laptop, go online. And the interest is more in terms of a little more intimate environments. If it's one person, they might have a favorite easy chair or a favorite two-person table or nook or cranny of the library. If it's a couple people who are used to studying together, they may also have a favorite place that isn't in the middle of a larger reading room. So while I really love the appeal and affection for that tradition of library reading rooms, I'm also pretty fascinated by the way it's being transformed. And curiously, I think that transformation plays really well in terms of managing the COVID condition. Doug, you have a comment?
I know I was just going to follow you. I thought you were wrapping up there, Ray, so I don't want to cut you off. But I saw that article that you referenced from the New York Times this morning. It was really interesting. You know, and one of the concepts that they addressed, which we talk a lot about at the libraries I'm involved in, is now kind of transforming, like you said, from the reading room to they use the expression, the community's living room. And so what we look to create in libraries more and more now, and I've seen that in your design, your designs, and, you know, the library we looked up in Vancouver is a space that people feel like they can come to and relax and explore. So creating that sort of feeling is more and more what people are responding to, what they're looking for. And I think you're right, it does, it also allows for a lot more flexibility, and the flexibility, adaptability lets you respond to things like a pandemic that might come along, or a shift in demand for certain kinds of services or usages. So that having an adaptable space is key, for sure. I don't know if at this point, yes.
Oh no, go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
Sorry. I don't know if at this point, Allison, you were saying other comments on library stuff. I had something I had to shift my focus for a second, so I didn't want to jump in. But I've got, of course, lots of thoughts about library arrangements.
Yeah, I actually just wanted. I saw, I think was a hand from Grover. So I wanted just to note that if that was a hand from Grover, go right ahead, and then Doug, we'll get some of your questions too.
Me, go ahead,
Okay.
or Grover, go ahead.
I'm always hesitant to use my opportunity to speak since I'm so limited on those. And so I really don't know that this should count, but you guys figure that out from there. I'm concerned about our deadline that we are looking at that I do believe is 2 weeks from today, that we want to come to some sort of conclusion about whether we are in fact going to go forward with citing the library on the Concord property versus not. And I have a long list of questions that I have submitted, but I read our charter and it has many of things that we're supposed to have covered that we haven't covered. So I'm concerned about getting that done in time, because I heard moments ago the alluding to that we can get into more detail once we have crossed that bridge. But as far as, you know, I don't expect life to always be in a pandemic lockdown. So I'm glad we're looking at what the options are to deal with that. But I'm concerned about making a decision in a timely fashion on the topic of does the library get cited there or not? And so I'm concerned there's not enough time built into this flow to do that. So that was a comment more than a question. It really is. I'd like to focus on in 2 weeks, mass 2 weeks, and if it's not, it's 3 weeks, we are going to be expected to make a choice. And just reading the charter and other things, we have lots of material that has not been covered. So I'm concerned. That was what I wanted to speak to.
Thanks, Grover. And to that, if you do have specific questions that, you know, might also be beneficial for the entire group to think through, and that we can utilize the expertise of Ray and Missy and Jim tonight, that would be great. Doug, I know you said you had some questions, but I just want to give it some space if there are folks with kind of these library questions, and, you know, maybe share with Grover's sentiment that there are some concerns that they have. Now's a great time to get them out there. And I'm not seeing hands at the moment, so I'm going to keep watching, but Doug, you go right ahead and pick us up.
Sorry. I was going to say, I share Grover's concerns to some degree. You know, and it's something that's interesting to me that in this, in the course of this planning and design stuff, it's a whole other thing that I don't know how we address. But, you know, I've said to a few people that I've spoken with that, you know, in this project, you know, Ncprd and the library are entering some sort of a union. I've used the term marriage, if you will, because, you know, we're individuals, but we're going to be individuals but partners at the same time. These two operations, and how do we go? And it's not just how the space is laid out, but how do we, in terms of operations and planning, go forward? You know, and we each have our own funding mechanisms and financial programs and financial concerns, and those can ebb and flow separately for each of us. We're not going to have a joint banking account, you know, and it's just the thought that down the road, you know, where will both of us be, the library and the Parks and Rec, and how might things change, and will we still be happy in our joint home, and not so much happy, but able to function as well as we both like to. I guess that's more how I think of it. You know, if there ends up being some budget constraints where one or the other needs to change their hours of operation, are we going to be sure that that each of the others can still function fully as they'd like to? Those are the kinds of things that weigh on me. You know, the plans things are great, and those I've got all kinds of questions and thoughts on some of those as well. But I think there are two separate things, and I'm with Grover on the concern about that and how to address that. And whether this group even can, that's a whole other thought. So I'm going to leave alone my thoughts on library design and layout, but I've got thoughts on those too. And and those can maybe even wait till after we've picked a plan that we really like.
Yeah, Dennis, go right ahead. You're on mute still, Dennis.
Alicia didn't hear me swear then. So, Doug, you're saying two elements. In terms of design, you don't have as much problem with the site. But in terms of the partnership, not knowing the future is what's bothersome to you. Is that true?
More or less. You know, there was the thought that was raised before about or toward the end of last meeting about, gosh, it would make more room on the property for more park space if we put a gym somewhere else, which didn't make sense to me. But you know, can we find an ideal win, and would we have more room on the property for park if we moved a library somewhere else? That's a thought. And it would be not so much because the library does not want, because I think a library community center partnership is and park collaboration, all that is outstanding. And it really excites me. That part is more a question of, are we compromising too much by trying to put too much in one space? That I don't know. We've got a lot going on here. Can we get a win all the way around on all the elements we're trying to address? Uncertain on that. So that's one part of it, Dennis, but the other part is maybe more strongly about just the ongoing mutual operation and the success of that, because we want both of those to be as successful as possible. Is that that's what you're asking, Dennis?
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm seeing some nodding heads around the group as Doug kind of mentioned some of these points. So I'm curious, maybe this is a question over to Catherine. What we're able to speak to right now in terms of, and maybe also for Scott and Laura, potentially operations, some of these considerations that Doug, I think there's a bunch of strands in what Doug was saying. One is about trade-offs on the site. One is about long-going operations and maintenance of each of these two programs operated through partnership. And then I think there's some of the questions about costs that I know, Jennifer, you give us that little teaser on with the slide. So Catherine, can you respond to any of those or maybe help frame some of this for us?
Well, this is what I suggest. I mean, there's a lot in all of those comments, but I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about cost and funding, because we have received a lot of questions about that. It also does tie into our partnership, and it might spur off some additional questions. So why don't we jump into the cost and see where that takes us, and see if, because I know there are a lot of questions, well, how much does the library cost? How much does the park cost? Those kinds of things. So let's give that a shot and see how it works.
Okay.
Hey, we can see your screen, Jennifer. Thank you.
Okay, great. And can you hear me too? Yes?
Yes.
Great. I lost all your windows of you all, but that's okay. So I heard a lot of questions, saw questions come in about wanting to understand better the difference between what that big number means and how it's divided between what Ncprd would be responsible for and what the library would be responsible for. So big overview, this slide, and I have another slide after this that has more details, so you can see a more detailed breakdown. But big overview gives you a picture of library cost and Ncprd. Library cost is covering anything specifically dedicated to the library and any of the shared space that is being shared with Ncprd up to the 19,500 square feet. That's it. The other cost is for the site area that is serving both projects. So the park is separated out, all the elements of the park, and we can look at that in a little more detail. is not part of that cost for the library. The remaining site area, which is comprised of the parking, the street frontages, the stormwater, the sidewalks, the entry plazas, all those are covered under shared costs. And and so we have been directed to split those costs in a 1/3, 2/3 proportion. So that's what we've started with. So if you're wondering how that was split, it's not half and half. It's 1/3 goes to the library of the shared pieces and 2/3 goes to Ncprd. So those are all the costs that are coming together, both building and site, to give you this total number here. And we can share these slides after the presentation, so you have more chance to digest this if that helps.
Yeah.
Any questions before I move into kind of the next level of detail? Since I can't see you all, you have to speak up if you do.
And I'm not seeing any hands initially, so maybe
okay,
we'll continue to the next slide.
Okay, I think the next slide will help a little bit more to describe what I'm referring to. So generally, we have each of our options, and we have highlighted the library portion, the Ncprd portion, and then the total at the bottom. So you can see that the library is covered for building, and then the library's portion of the site. Same for Ncprd, the community center costs, the Ncprd office cost, the park cost, and then Ncprd's portion of the general site. And then a total at the bottom. And I think what is interesting in this slide is, I know we have talked in the past about what the cost per square foot is. So understand that this average cost per square foot is for building and for site. But you can understand that generally the freestanding options are higher in cost than the addition options, and the no addition options are the lowest in cost. So it's kind of a way to think about it, that there are kind of three sets of consideration here when looking at these numbers. Now, obviously, when you look at the cost of Ncprd's portion, it's being spread over many elements, and it's also being spread more over the renovation space than the brand new space. There is new space in that as well for the gyms. When the schemes that have gyms added to them, you can see that those costs are higher for that. So there is an average cost per square foot for each of these, and then this is combined at the end, so you can see total project average cost per square foot. You can see how that's delineated. One thing I want to be really clear about is that there have been a lot of questions about seismic, and I know there's a lot of questions about pertaining to cost and funding sources tonight. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on seismic, but I do want to address the concerns that I'm hearing pertaining to the Concord building not being safe. No option that we put out here is considered to be less than what would be required for a new building. We are required in developing a new an existing building or a new building to bring it up to the code level standard, which we talked about in the seismic meeting, which is the life safety standard. That is what code requires. It requires it of a renovation. It requires it of a new building. So there isn't a difference in what we as professionals are required to do in renovating an existing building. We are not carrying in the cost of this project the cost to go up to essential services building, which means it's operational through an emergency. And when we talked in our meeting on seismic, the conversation was that we will certainly do what is safe for people to be able to get out of the building, but we are not carrying the cost at this point of taking it up to that essential services like an emergency center or a police station or a hospital. We also identified there are possibilities for potential grants for that. So that's out there as a possibility, but at this point of the project, we are not carrying that higher level in the cost. Typically, I just want to touch on, I have one more slide in here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. Grover, I know you had a lot of questions, and I don't think you were able to be at that presentation, but we did talk about this in a way that you could understand. This is the level right here that the building code requires you to do. For a new building, for a renovated building, if you're touching the structure and touching the lateral system or changing it, we are required to be at that level. That is carried in our cost. We are not right now carrying costs to go up to the immediate occupancy level. So I just want to make sure, and we can have further discussions about seismic in that. Seismic upgrade means tying the brick to the walls. It means tying the roof to the walls. It means tying the floors to the walls. You're making a structure that can withstand an earthquake to be able to get out. So I'm hoping that's answering some of your questions. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I do want to assure you that we do have that life safety level of seismic upgrade for Concord and for the new building in the current costs. So Catherine, I'm gonna, I can open it up for questions at this point, if that makes sense. If anybody has some follow-up questions to any of that, I can also go back to one of the other slides if that helps.
I see a hand from Dennis. Maybe over to Dennis, and then we'll get to that operations piece too.
So this question maybe is better to come before Catherine speaks, but so I know we have a strong value around stewardship of funding, and considering that, looking at the numbers, it's clearly that the freestanding libraries are on paper about 7 million more. So the question really maybe is for the county is the freestanding library really a viable option financially? I know that's a big question. And maybe we don't answer it, but I'll put it out there.
I'll get
that
it.
also got the last from Mike, so.
Yeah.
And it looks like Grover's a follow-up question. So Catherine, over to you, and then I'll get Grover.
Well, let's see what Grover's is first before we move on, just in case.
Grover, go ahead.
Okay, listening to, looking at the materials that we were given before, I did the math myself, and you said to add 30% to all the costs. These costs don't reflect that 30% higher. So, correct, they don't, right? They do not.
Correct. These are direct construction only.
Exactly, but for the people over here who have to figure out where the money's going to come from and so on and so forth, you add 30%. And then the other, the premise is the 1/3, 2/3. I'm real hard pressed to find how that number fits. 19,500 square foot of library. When I did the math based on that, by the way, adding 32% to, 30% to the option 1A takes it to around $41 2/3 million. But then dividing back out by square footage of building, one bit of square footage of building versus another, it brings it down to that the library is only 11 million, and I don't want to make only like that, but then you go down and look at the North Edition version, and it's only $500,000 difference. So I'm hard pressed with that bit of math and so on and so forth, not challenging anyone's math, it's that what are we looking at? But secondarily to that, it has been spoken by many people who are attached to who's paying for this, saying that our community is going to get this great place that in an emergency we could go, and yet we're not planning for that. So when we talk about the good and being stewards of the funding and so on and so forth, we really do have to look at how much difference is that cost, because case in point, we live between a river and a hill. And if we had a significant earthquake, as an example, the bridges will cut us off at the south and the bridges will cut us off in the north. And now we are pretty much isolated here and we have nothing. We have nowhere to go for about 50 to 60,000 people. So I don't want to just dismiss, oh, okay, well, code says, I appreciate that. But I do think we need to look at what we're investing our money in. And then the idea is, where we sat before this came in, we were looking at reciprocal libraries. Case in point, Reading Library, case in point, Oregon City Library. $11 million for a library is dead on in the same kind of cost that they spent. So that's not an unreasonable number for a freestanding library. And by the way, it's been 12 years that we've been waiting for one, and it's going to be another 3 to 5 years, even if we go forward with this. So I really do think people need to be aware of what's included in these assumptions. That's really what I wanted to get to. And that's all I had to say for now. But it's like, nobody did wrong, but people who are going to make choices need to take all this into account. I'm done.
Okay, great. So that's actually a good segue. Jennifer, would you mind just stop sharing the screen just for a second?
Mhm.
I just feel like I can't see everybody when when there's something on the screen. So Grover, your comments, what we're doing here, and I think it sort of goes back to what Kim was talking about last week when one of her first questions is, what's our budget here? And it's a really good question, right? So one of the things about doing a master plan, and I used the word feasibility study last week, is because what we're doing is doing research into the possibilities for our needs. And we're learning this as staff at the same time you're learning this as community members. And so what we have to do as we learn more and more, we need to make certain assumptions as we go along. And that's why you're here, is to make sure that we're making the right assumptions. And sometimes our assumptions are wrong and we have to go back and correct them and move on. It's just kind of the nature of the work. So with that, I want to share what we know about project funding right now. And then we can come back and talk some more. So because there were so many questions about it, and Dennis and others have asked, is the freestanding building viable? It also depends on, the criteria. Cost is one criteria that's part of your criteria, right? And part of that, I was just looking at it, it says, where did it go? Good value for the money is one of the considerations. And so if you think about it, how do we know what's good value for the money until we know what we can build? And so that's part of what we're learning here. The other one is cost efficient operations. Now that's really important too. We've made an assumption that if we share things, they will be cheaper. We haven't tested that completely, but we have a sense that that's probably true. So just as we move forward with this funding piece, I want to make sure we keep all of the various pieces of funding in mind. So it's like, what are you getting for your money? And then also, what are the operations? And then when we look at all of the criteria in terms of balancing needs, I know Jim says this a lot when he's talking about the design, is like, we've got a lot of needs and we need to find that sweet spot, like when you're playing tennis, where we feel like we are meeting the needs at a high level and it's really worth it to move forward. I guess so. With that, let's go back to the funding piece that I worked on a little bit, and then we'll come back and talk. So I think Jennifer's got the slide. So you guys, in last September, we had an optional meeting, and I know some of you are newer on the task force, but we had a whiteboard meeting and we talked about a lot of this. So I'm going to start with Ncprd. As Doug said, we're married in this particular phase of the project anyway. So this is what we talked about partly last September, and then we've learned a little bit since then. It's like, this is the evolving process of learning through the master planning. So to Grover, to your point a minute ago, so these numbers don't look the same as the ones that Jennifer showed because we did add the 30%. We think 30% is a good number, but in these early days, it's a good budget figure for us to use. So we're seeing in the alternatives that Jennifer just showed a range of total project costs now of 13.1 to 25.6. So in all of the alternatives, the 5 alternatives, you notice that we didn't spend, or actually the design team didn't spend a lot of time illustrating that because we felt it was pretty low on the values. So that's where those low numbers come in. And then and then there's the higher numbers when we've got the full remodel and the gym. The funding sources that we've talked about so far for Ncprd are for the park, where there's some separate opportunities for the park. One is it's a local share, Metro bond local share, which we will receive. And so we know we could use some of that, we can use that money for a park. And then we've also been Ncprd has been very successful at getting grants for parks. So that's a good possibility. Then on the community center and offices, we have, just like the library, assumed a revenue bond. And then there's some potential savings there if we do our bonds together, Ncprd and the library. So that's a possibility. We also have some disposition proceeds from Hoodview Park. In terms of SDCs, for those of you that don't know, those are fees that are charged on new development. Ncprd collects those fees for parks. And to be able to use them, you need to have a particular project in your capital plan. And right now, this project isn't in the capital plan, but we do have the possibility of being able to add it to the capital plan. And in that case, SDCs would be available. We've also been talking, and you may have heard some of the commissioners also talking about a general obligation bond for Ncprd. Now, obviously, when you get into something like that, which is a voter approved bond, we might be considering something like phasing on the project. And then also we may be able to get some seismic grant money. So there's nothing here that is maybe specific enough to some of your questions, but this is where we are. The library has had a long time to be working on a project. Ncprd has not had as much time to work through specific funding sources, but the way to understand, partly to understand the funding sources, to understand what you're going to build. So when we understand more about what the cost is, we can start aligning those sources and uses. So that's Ncprd. And then I'm just going to go to the library. Okay, so this is total, and the total project cost. I realized I forgot to type that in on the previous slide, but so again, these costs are including the 30% markup for soft costs, or what Jennifer described as indirect costs last week. So this is a combined project, as you know, the Gladstone and the Oak Lodge Library. So we're looking at those two projects together. So Gladstone was interesting when the alternatives were reviewed there, and the cost estimator came up with pretty similar costs. It doesn't look like that's going to be a deciding factor for Gladstone. It's smaller, much fewer elements, a lot of different reasons, but it's a simpler project. The Oak Lodge Library, as you know, it has a range of 7.4 to 16, which gives us quite a big range for us to be thinking about for a total of $12 to $21 million. So those are the kinds of numbers we're working with. We're grappling with this as you are. The low end is the fives, is what basically on the Oak Lodge side, the 5 options, number 5 option. And then the higher ones are the ones that are the freestanding options. So clearly there are higher, like there's a $3 million difference between a freestanding option of a library and and one that is an addition and also shares more things with the Concord building. So these are the funding sources. We outlined these pretty much the same last time when we met in September, but we have some library district reserve, Clackamas County Capital. We have the Oak Lodge beginning fund balance. Here we've also talked about a library bond. It would be based on an annual $310,000 annual payment. As you can see, the library's done a little bit more work to sort out what they could bond for. And then also potentially some seismic grant if it is shared with Ncprd. That's yet to be determined based on your recommendation to the board. So we have a subtotal of funds that we know about of 8.7 million, and we're looking at a gap, which you might recall that we had commissioners come to the meeting, we had our county administrator come to the meeting, and they said the county is going to build a library per the settlement agreement. And so that is when the idea of having a Clackamas County bond came up. So right now that is the source for filling the gap. So the gap runs from 3.6 million to 12.5, depending on which alternatives you're homing in on. Clearly, you know, money is always an issue. I think I mentioned last time to Kim in a very simple way, I said, you know, the sky is obviously not the limit because we have to be good stewards of funding. So right now, the only identified source to fill the gap is the county board. And we would need to ask, I said, it says county, we would need to ask the board how much they are willing to fill that gap. There's also potential for private sources to fill a gap, but that would obviously take longer, probably. So that's what I got.
Catherine, I see a hand from Kim, and I think that's appropriate since we were referencing really the question she asked last week.
So why
Kim,
don't you stop screen sharing so I can see everybody again. And
yeah,
Kim, go ahead.
Thanks. So I think my question, and thank you for explaining all of that. It's really helpful. Talking about a voter approved bond potentially with that. I know that North Clackamas just had a school bond that was pretty expensive that I know a lot of people were hurt by homeowners, friends that I have, and we're in a pandemic and a recession at this point. So how likely would it be that this project would be relying on funds from an increase in property taxes?
Well, you know, it depends. Well, I think ideally we wouldn't have to rely on a voter approved bond for this particular project. It would be great if we could put together a variety of sources that would complete this project. And then Ncprd has other needs, and maybe Scott wants to talk to this. Ncprd has other needs that their long-term goal is to do a voter approved bond for a variety of projects. So it wouldn't be just this single project. Ideally, we'd come up with something that didn't require that for this project.
Is there a threshold where it's like if the project goes past this budget point, that's where we would need the bond? Like, is that the freestanding library option, or is it, we're just not sure?
Well, the Ncprd funds are different than the library funds. So Ncprd would not be, well, actually, that's not true. Because, you know, when you do the freestanding option, essentially there's no sharing between Ncprd and the library, less sharing. and less sharing in operational costs as well. So that decision would affect Ncprd. And essentially what it does, and plus, you know, you have the entire building is then community center, which Ncprd probably is not prepared to be able to afford immediately. Maybe there would be something phased. We'd have to start really digging into, can we phase this? You know, what are our options? But I would say, Scott, correct me or kick me if you want to. Like if the voter approved bond would be sort of the least favorite because it would slow us down.
So I know Laura had a hand. I think Laura, you wanted to chime in, and Scott, you might be doing some kicking here. So maybe over to Laura and then Scott.
So for the library side of all of this, we were not looking at voter approved. We were looking at what's called a revenue bond, which is one that would be issued by the county for that gap that we were talking about, and one that would be issued, well, both would be issued by the county, but a portion of the funds to pay for it would come from the library operating dollars. And that was that $310,000 that you saw on the screen when it was up there. And then for Ncprd also, we know that we can do the project, I believe, without issuing a GO bond. We could also do a revenue bond. But that would depend on, again, picking something that is efficient. Because I know that the county, you know, they are willing to fill a gap, but they're not, the sky is not the limit. And I can tell you that they, in their 5-year forecast, they put in a payment of $600,000 per year for 20 years, which equaled about 8.8 million. If you remember from the last screen, I think the number was over 12 million. So that would be a decision for the Board of County Commissioners, whether they're willing to go more than that 8 million that they had identified. I can tell you that the county has a budget shortfall and had to cut over $6 million in the budget for 2021. I also know that they have a budget shortfall for 21-22. So again, I know that they are going to be looking for an efficient option. And I believe that if we continue this process and we look at the values that we identified up front, that we will come to a good conclusion and there will be an option that does work. An underlying premise of this entire project has been that we would do this by sharing services, by sharing staff, by sharing space, by sharing the janitor. I mean, just everything. And that's why you see in your options that the standalone building is much more expensive, because there is no sharing happening there. And so it's not as efficient. So again, I go back to, if we look at our values and we really stand to the values that you all came up with, I believe that you will all come to a good decision in the end. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Laura. Scott.
I'll just add briefly. Laura did a great job of describing, I think, mostly what I would have said. But I think I would just reiterate again from the Park District's perspective. So from Ncprd's perspective, what the message that Laura just said about the efficiencies of sharing costs, both in the construction as well as the operation. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think probably people misunderstand this, and it's a common thing to misunderstand. It's easier to build something than it is to take care of it. And so the long-term maintenance is a really big consideration. And I think we've always had this idea of the partnership and the relationship. Doug, I'm going back to what you said earlier about the relationship between the library and the Park District. Those two things are, there are things to work out, and there are issues that certainly can arise, but I think our services are very, very symbiotic, and we work together. It happens in communities, in a lot of places that there's partnerships between parks and recreation and libraries, and so we would love the opportunity to have that relationship if that's where this all goes. But I think we can't. I don't think we can overstate the importance of the sharing of these resources, that both from the library and the Park District perspective are definitely limited, and we're going to have to be, you know, creative as to how we put our whole package of funding together. So that's all I would add.
Thanks, Scott. Dennis, I just want to check in really quickly with you. Your question kind of kicked off this conversation, and it was a very direct question. And I think you got a lot of nuanced answers, but I'm curious if you kind of feel like you got the information that you needed that precipitated your question. You're on mute, Bill.
So yes, absolutely. I think Laura's comments were poignant for me. They resonated with me around efficiency and working together, and a voice of optimism. We share that together, I would say. But yeah, it's clearer than it was to me. And I understand maybe the dynamics of the pressure and the power, but there is this question that's out there that ultimately, I guess the county will have to come up with a gap number of sorts. So, but no, thank you. That's more than I expected to hear.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah.
Okay, Grover, I see your hand, and then if you do have questions, folks, or comments, feel free to put your hands up. Okay, Jan, I see you too. Grover, and then Jan.
I will yield to Jan first. I'd like to follow her.
Okay. Jan,
Okay. Well, thank you. I do have questions about the funding, but I'm going to let Grover focus on that since that's his area of expertise. But as a former bookseller for 18 years, I just wanted to say that for me, we have to think about the cost of labor a lot more than we used to because of, you know, just the changes in everything we do to pay people fairly, and that's good. But I notice on some of the plans, we have like a workroom that might be a big workroom off in the corner, but sometimes you need staging areas where you can, like if you have the kids department, you might want to have a back staging area where you can park carts, and so when you go to recover and you put stuff back there, you're not going all the way across and then all the way back, all the way across and all the way, and that eats up all your payroll. So that's just something I wanted to mention. And then I had a really crazy idea, so I'm just going to say conveyor belt, book, conveyor belt. When I was a kid, I used to go to this restaurant that had a train set that went all the way around the restaurant. And of course, they gave you like Rob Roy drinks or, you know, where and it had this, you know, clowns came to the table. Now we would think it was scary, but back in the day. But contactless touching with the books, and you know, wouldn't it be cool if you could have something like a dry cleaner has, and it was, or like Amazon, only it's cool and maybe it's steampunk looking and quieter. And then I go in and I do I search for my book on an iPad that's on a screen or something that can be easily cleaned, and then I just push the number and my book zzz, comes around. I don't know, something to think about. No shelf. Just a giant conveyor belt that goes around and virtual screens. Okay.
Jan has brought us a vision of the future. To Jan's point on the workroom, I'm curious if Missy or Ray or Jim, if you have any comments on that before we move on.
If we have our conveyor belt, we don't need a workroom. See.
Well, probably the item today would be a sorter. Yeah, a sorter comes close to what Jan is talking about, but doesn't go as far as to go get the book and deliver. Well, you've made some good points, Jan. I don't see it a problem having the workroom all together, as long as we have enough space in that workroom to do the various functions for the library. You know, there could be an argument made to put an office more in the new, depending upon which plan that we pick, to spread offices out just to help with security. But I just don't see it necessary to split the workroom up. I don't see a huge amount of efficiency that would be gained by doing that. Ray may have more to add to it.
Well, I would observe just that there are times when you have a minimal staff in the library, and so that staff being able to know where each other is and do whatever work needs to be done. Kind of steers you towards one workroom. When you get well over 20,000 square feet, you know, up to about 40, you start seeing as many as 3 different workrooms. They're dedicated to collections because you have that much area, and you need a person off in the children's area and a person off in the nonfiction and reference area that are working with patrons on those particular parts of the library. But at 19,500 square feet, it's just not quite, there's not that demand, and it doesn't support that degree of staffing. So you work backwards and end up with a single meeting room being more efficient that way. I like the conveyor belt though. That would be cool.
People would come to the library just to see the conveyor belt.
Yeah, right. Sushi.
Thanks, Ray and Misty. Okay, Grover, go right ahead.
Great. So there's several things, and I did appreciate, Laura, you, I've heard that presentation, the parts of that before, and it's right on. Picking up with what Kim said, you know, not only did North Clackamas Parks have a pretty hefty school bond, all of us that live in Jennings Lodge, we are in the Oregon City School District, and they also had a pretty hefty, and it just took a huge hit into my property taxes. So that's where I'm sitting on that. But I've been on the library board for a good while now, and we've been focusing on what are we going to do, and the idea of looking at this as a marriage, as a cooperation, has a great appeal. In fact, we had a lot to do with putting these 2 projects together, as opposed to having to go to the Ncprd meeting and then go to the library meeting. So we're in favor of that. But when it starts talking about that, well, you know, having us just stay in the existing Concord building, no North Addition, and certainly no standalone, that's totally unreasonable. That's not a good use of funds, etc. I have some pushback on that. The settlement agreement actually talked about that the Gladstone Library is going to cost $1.8 million, not north or south of $5 million. And that our library was supposed to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 million, not anywhere in the 7.4 to 16.1. So I have trouble, and we've always been waiting. And yes, the county has talked about the benefit of having it be a community center where people could go to an emergency and so on and so forth. So we need to take that into account. And if you would look at the bulk of the questions that I sent, and I think I sent, what, 20 some odd questions, the point is, or actually only 11, I lied, is that most of mine focused on what could we do to make the number 2 option, which is the North Addition, work. And I am not wedded that we have to stay at a full 19,500 square feet for library, particularly if there's a good use of community meeting rooms, etc., in the adjacent building. So that's where I want to focus this time. But I get scared when I hear comments that pretty much say that the library, being on the library board, that, gee, having your own library is, no, it's not in the cards. And that isn't what we've worked so hard to bring this together and look at this and then get shorted on that. So I'm not saying we are, but I'm still working to find a way to get this decision made between now and that artificial deadline that got pushed into an IGA that says and then we were so slow to get started in this process to now be racing at the end. Well, that's kind of like life is normal, but I want us to be able to look at what's in the best interest of the library, and we need to look at stuff that is besides a lot of stuff we spend our time looking at. So let me see what else I had to say. The only last thing I said is that I appreciated the idea that there are money that are available in the SDCs, but they're not in the master plan. And yet, when does the master plan, or what does it take to update it? Because there is money in SDCs that came from unincorporated Clackamas County residents in the Ncprd who live west of 205, and it has not yet been committed from anywhere I've seen. And I don't know why it's going to automatically go where it's going, to a much smaller population than the population we're serving. So it's not decided. It has not been publicly decided. It's been discussed. So I just really want us to work together on this partnership to make it work. But I'm not interested in all of a sudden getting the short end of the stick. And if you don't go into the seismically safe but not survivable investment into one building, I'm just having a problem with that. So I'm done.
I didn't hear that anything's off the table.
Time is telling us it's off the table. So and nobody said it was off the table.
I'm not feeling that.
Well, okay, good. We don't feel the same stuff.
Yeah.
So we have spent kind of the bulk of our meeting, and we're getting into winding things up, and I want to make sure we have some time for public comment. But I want to open it up. It feels like cost was an important thing to spend this time on, so hopefully this was an illuminating conversation for folks, and it's helping with thinking about your evaluation. I see some folks are chiming into the chat with their opinions. But if anybody is sitting with a question that they were really hoping to get answered tonight, I maybe want to open up that space for somebody who hasn't had an opportunity to share before we move into public comments, with the caveat that I think Catherine kind of works overtime on this project, but I believe that she's willing to, Gary, I see your hand, so I'll get to you, but she's also willing to answer some of those questions that folks might have. Why don't we just kind of air some of those questions out, and then we can see what we can address maybe quickly now, or what might be for follow-up, and get a sense if other folks have similar questions. So I saw a hand from Gary. I saw a hand from Jan. So Gary, why don't you go ahead and just kind of what you're sitting with, or a topic that you have additional questions on.
This isn't a burning question I've been waiting to ask all night, but I think I heard Catherine say something about she was going to share a lot of the data that was presented tonight, the new data, and I just wondered how soon that would be out.
That's an excellent question. I think we could clear up now.
Yeah, I can, I don't know how big the presentation is, but I think I could even send it out tonight. Right, Jennifer? Yeah.
Yeah, it's only the 7 slides. So yeah, we can PDF what we have, and it can go out right after the meeting.
Yeah, and I know I also sent it to Amber before this meeting, and it'll be posted probably by Monday on the website.
Okay, thank you.
So Jan, I saw your hand, but anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to speak, and also Shonda, if that person is you, go ahead and chime in because I can't see your hand if you have a question that you're sitting with.
Well, some of my questions have been semi-answered. I had a question about the seismic retrofit and to which level we're going to be involved with, and if that is included in the cost. And yes, the discussion of the money was good. I'd like to see paperwork. Obviously, I didn't see the slides. So I'd like to see the money on paper. My personal opinion, I like option 2 the best, but I like it with a parking lot of option 4.
Thank you, Shonda. And I think that that information will be coming shortly. Mark, I see your hand. Kind of, what are you sitting with right now?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, at some point, hear from the design team what their preferences are and why that would be.
You little scamp. You want to just get them to share their answers. Thank you, Mark. I think that speaks to, like, in their professional experience and their expertise, kind of where they're leaning with. And we might be able to get some of that in our discussions next week when we're talking about your evaluation. Jan.
Yeah, just an additional way to add space. You guys are already probably thinking about this, so silly for me to even bring it up, but just some kind of cantilever doors that could open sideways so we could make a room be inside and outside with an overhang so we can have an event, would be awesome. And then for seating that's COVID-19 protective, or whatever you want to say, those kind of, they used to call them telephone tables or love seat couches, where I face this way and you face that way, and it's kind of an S. So like a pod more than a table, with maybe some high sides. And a cushion that when it gets gross, you can throw it away instead of like an upholstered chair, which at Barnes & Noble, we hated the upholstered chairs. They smelled, they got full of, we don't even want to tell you what was in them. Don't want upholstered in a library. A seat cushion, you can chuck it or cover over it, and it's cheap.
Nice. Nice.
All right, Jan. Jen getting into some nitty gritty with those stinky chairs. I appreciate that. Okay, Doug, over to you.
Yeah, just one last thought I had that I'd like to contribute just before we get into public comment. I know we're getting close on time, but you know, like Grover was talking about the thought of the idea that's been put out there about having a place that can be a shelter in an earthquake emergency, that kind of thing. You know, I've liked that idea too. I've thought about that with the library I work at out in Happy Valley, and to what capacity that might be able to function. I don't know to what degree the design was meant for that, but it's one of those where we sort of had in mind, you know, when the earthquake hits, when we'll see what the library's like and we'll do what we can, is sort of how we're looking at it. I'd love to see a building done, but I don't know if our design team would even be able to say, to try and retrofit this to meet that higher standard, what the additional cost. Presumably there's a significant additional cost in the budget for that, and we're already worried about our costs. So that'd be one of those things where, yeah, ideally there'd be some kind of a grant that would come along and say, you know, this community could really use a place. And as Grover said, we've got a significant population that would be stranded with all the things surrounding us. You know, if we could get a grant that would help us be able to do that, whether that'd be something to be added along down the road. But I would expect that's to be able to say we're going to fix this building, retrofit it, and have all new construction seismically done in order to make us significantly better. I would assume that's much more expensive.
Probably cheaper to build a bomb shelter.
Well, I just want to add, and I know we don't have time to talk, but we did have some costs delineated in that seismic presentation, and that would be for the Concord building. So, you know, if you wanted to go up to that level in a new building, that would also be an additional cost that wasn't outlined in that. We wouldn't know that till we got into the design, but it can be figured out. So.
Well, on that,
sorry, Grover, we really do kind of have to start wrapping up, but go ahead, a quick point.
7,000 square feet in option 2 in a new building. I'd like to know what it would cost to have that new building, not the retrofitting Concord building, but not 11,000 square feet, having it be meeting essential building. I'd like to know what that cost is.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is Jim. I mean, you're mentioning the library, but actually the flat floor gymnasium could be one of the more ideal locations, and you know, with kitchen, other services. But yeah, and it's not just seismic, it's also mechanical, electrical, plumbing. There's a lot of other additional costs to really make it usable during a seismic event. So,
well, because you know, we said we'd never have a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't say that.
I know, but we didn't plan for it.
Just kidding.
And a reminder for the group, this has come up, but you know, your Board of County Commissioners is the ultimate decision maker in this process, and you can certainly provide caveats in your recommendation. You know, I think we're starting to hear folks kind of talking about some of those things, but if it's your recommendation, let's talk about that over the next few months, and you know, you're welcome to recommend what you as a group want to recommend, and we're aiming for consensus, but I think we're going to have some rich conversation over the next few months, and Grover made that little money sign, so I see that. Catherine, we do need to get into public comment, but I'm curious if you just want to outline some next steps briefly. And if you are here to make public comment and you'd like to go ahead and raise your hand, if you're on your phone by pressing *9 or hovering over your name, while Catherine outlines the next steps, I'll just look for folks who are here to make public comment and then go in order. So Catherine, over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen? I won't spend too much time on this. It's not different than what you've seen before. our goal for next week is to go through the criteria evaluation. I think that's really going to be helpful as the next step from this conversation, because we'll be really sort of talking about all of the issues all in one meeting. So I'm looking forward to that. The goal would be to see if there are 3 alternates that you can recommend for public review. So that's next week. And then as Grover's mentioned, we are shooting for July 2nd to determine whether or not you believe the Oak Lodge Library can be located on the Concord property. And just the new information, we have got a policy scheduled with the board on July 14th to bring them up to date to where we are prior to going out to the public with our open house. So I think we're doing well, and I really appreciate all of the work. I know meeting weekly is tough for everybody, a lot of people. So that's where we are.
And you will be getting a survey to help kind of frame that evaluation. I know it's going to be quick, it's kind of a quick turnaround since we're meeting next week. But Catherine will be sending the link shortly, and that'll just be your own evaluation of the different alternatives using a red, yellow, green. If you could have that done by Tuesday, by the end of the day, then that'll help me put something together so that we can look and kind of see. I won't attribute your names to the results, but just to see in general, like where are you as a task force in agreement and where are there areas of disagreement. So look for that link and homework in by Tuesday if possible. Doug, we got a letter last time, and I think you're going to chat us through a little bit of that written public comment that was received as we kick off our public comment period.
Sure, yeah, it was something that was addressed as a public comment last time. Somebody was asking about it, and I don't know if it gotten around, but the Oak Grove Community Council, which is a community planning organization in Clackamas County here, they wrote a letter asking, appreciating what we're working on, but wanting us to consider the community, especially community members who are disabled or have limited mobility in our planning. And of course, the design plans will be required to meet ADA requirements. So that's one thing, but I think it's something worth us considering, and I'm sure one of our criteria will help us address this. They talked about that there are several advisory boards and commissions in the area that represent the interests of people who are older, who have limited mobility or disabled and such. And to get some feedback to say, okay, yes, it's ADA, but it's still kind of a long haul from here to there. And then look at some of the different areas that we've got. And so I think it's good for us to consider. I appreciate the Oak Grove Community Council giving us that encouragement to make sure we're really looking at the needy people in our community for the various needs, to make sure that this community center really is something that will be able to serve as many people as possible well. And so I don't know if we had any hands raised for public comment. I don't see any. We could open it up to see if Commissioner Savas would like to add any words to what's been said tonight.
Oh, I was, thank you, Doug, for that. I was just envisioning what it would be like to be in your shoes, going through the decisions you all need to make. And I can see really how some of these things might get conflated between what's ideal for the park, the Parks District, and what's ideal for the library. Easy to conflate the two. And I thought that the discussion on the community center was, kind of specific to that. And probably, just thinking about an emergency and the work that we do as county commissioners, as far as, planning in that kind of event, what options or properties the county might use in a state of emergency, and, existing schools and buildings in the area. So it would seem to be that a community center or a sizable, the gym would be something more of I won't say a burden, but more of a likely landing place for the Parks District hat, if you're wearing that, to consider more so than perhaps the library per se to bear. So I know it's difficult. I know the Gladstone group is moving because they know what they're doing. It's simple. They don't have this these two issues to deal with, or these two opportunities, if you will, the district and the library project to move forward on. But I appreciate what you're all doing. I would love to see how you navigate all of this. And bear in mind, I don't know, I forgot what the then I'll go back and look at what the guiding principles are for your work. I know it was referenced earlier as far as the priorities, but I think that's a good thing to maybe revisit at some point, whether you do it at home or not, or do it as a group, but to make sure that, you know, those still align with where you all want to go. You know, you don't want to necessarily till that soil again. I can understand that, but it's always good to refresh where you're coming from. And again, not conflate the two, but look at them in two different aspects. As someone who gets involved in a lot of engineering, I know that compromise is common and perfection is something you strive for, but you can't always get there. And cost is another factor. So I'm sorry for the long-winded response, but I can sympathize. But I'm also excited because I think we have to look at the upside and where we're going. So I do appreciate your work, and let's see how you navigate this. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, final call for any hands up for public comment. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so we'll go ahead and close public comment, but folks are always welcome to submit written public comments to Catherine to be circulated with the task force. Doug, over to you.
Had one last something to add.
I wanted to add something, Doug. I just wanted to acknowledge that Gary sent a pretty long list of questions at about 5 o'clock or so today. And then, you know, Grover's came in yesterday. So what I'd like, you know, if there are those of you who feel like your questions, you know, did not get answered and they are still, you know, burning and appropriate for a master plan level of decision making, I'm happy to talk to you and figure out how we can get your questions answered.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, well, Commissioner Savas, I think you touched on right where we're heading next week. Excited to be going through our criteria and really, you know, I've spent some time looking at these plans and all the lines and maps and layouts and things, but I haven't put them up next to our criteria yet, and that's what we'll be doing next week. And I'm excited to really see how once we go through those. So the survey will help us get there. I'll overlook, Commissioner Savas, how you said that the Gladstone group really knows what they're doing, because the implications are a little uncertain, but I'm sure you meant nothing there. Anyway, you look for that email from Allison. Keep thinking about what your any questions you've got about what's going forward, and keep that excitement going, because I'm feeling it. There's a lot happening here, and the possibilities are terrific, and the team and the support we've got here is also terrific. So you guys all take care. Be good to yourselves during all this, and we'll see you next. Oh, Mike, did you have something you wanted to add there, right?
Yeah. Can I go inside now? It's really cold out here.
Yeah, Mike, it's sunny where I am. Come on over to my house. I can practically see your house from here. All right, everybody. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.